Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this year's Pharma R&D Annual Review, Navigating the Landscape. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions for us during the webinar, you can leave a question in the questions box to the right of your screen. If we get time at the end, we will endeavour to answer any of your questions. And if we don't, we'll be getting a report of them all at the end of the webinar, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Also, the webinar is being recorded, so after the presentation, you will receive a link to the full webinar and the slides. There's quite a lot of information we're going to be imparting, so we're going to go fairly quickly. So if you do miss something, don't worry, because we'll be sending you the recording. And of course, you can also download all of the information in the webinar, plus a lot more in the Pharma R&D Annual Review Report, which is available as a free download. So let me introduce myself. My name is Ian Lloyd. I'm the Senior Director for Pharma Projects as part of the Sightline suite that's published by Informa Pharma Intelligence. I'm the author of the Annual Pharma R&D report, which I've been writing now for 30 years, so we're celebrating the 30th anniversary here. And my co-host is Alex. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Ian. Hi, I'm Alex Shimmings. I'm the Executive Editor for Europe for commercial news for Scrip, Pink Sheet and in vivo, and I've been writing about pharma R&D for about 25 years.
Great, thanks Alex. So let's have a look at our agenda for today. Following the introduction, we'll be looking at the drug R&D pipeline in 2022 and how it is changing. Kicking off with the headline figure of the total pipeline size. Then I'll be handing back to Alex for a look at the success stories of 2021, the drugs which newly made it to the market. And then we'll be slicing and dicing the pipeline by a number of different metrics, looking at the leading companies, the top therapies, top diseases, most popular mechanisms and targets. And then I'll be moving on to a section where I've highlighted 4 key trends for 2022. Not surprisingly, one of these is COVID, another is rare diseases, a third cell and gene therapy, and then also we'll be looking at the explosion of R&D that's currently happening in China. Then we'll go back to Alex for the outlook for 2022, where she'll be looking at launches expected from drugs already approved in 2022 and the drug approvals to look out for this year. And then we'll have conclusions, as I mentioned. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So first of all, the total drug R&D pipeline in 2022. I should point out that throughout the presentation, when we talk about pipeline, we're talking about drugs reported by the Pharma Projects database, which are in commercial development, anywhere from early preclinical development, all through the clinical stages, the registrational phases, up to and including some drugs which are on the market. They are still counted as part of the pipeline, provided they're still being developed in additional markets or for new indications. So how many drugs fall into this bucket in 2022? Well, the total number is now over 20,000 for the first time. This graph shows you the total pipeline size every year since 2001. You see 20,109 drugs are in active development, and the pipeline size has grown by 8.2% over the year. This is an expansion of the acceleration rate we saw the previous year when it was only 4.8%, and it's also above the 5-year average of 6.3%. 1,527 more drugs are in development than were at the same time last year. But this kind of undersells the amount of new R&D that's been happening during the year, as nearly 6,500 new drugs were identified by us during the year, versus 5,500 the previous year. But over 4,500 left the pipeline in the year as well. So it just gives you an indication of just how much churn there is within the R&D pipeline within a single year. For the new drugs reported during the 2021-22 period, nearly 39% were anti-cancers, nearly 15% were neurologicals, and nearly 12% were anti-infectives. And we'll be looking at more statistics about therapeutic area shortly. But first, it's back to Alex for a review of the drugs which successfully made the market during 2021.
Thanks, Ian. So, as you can see from this chart, 2021 was a record year for novel drug launches, with 97. The slide shows the number of new active substances that have been launched for the past 20 years, and vaccines are highlighted at the top of each bar in grey. I just need to clarify that this research focuses exclusively on new active substances, and we define those as new chemical or biological entities where the active ingredient has received no prior approval for human use. So it excludes formulations or biosimilars. So as I said, there were 97 new active substances launched last year, and they came across 95 products because 2 of those launches were combination products with 2 NASs in them. That also includes 13 vaccines. So the chart shows that the trend for NAS launches is most definitely going upwards. But to get a better handle on the trends, we can look at the 5-year means for NAS launches. And this confirms that actually the numbers, the rise is actually accelerating. So the 5-year mean for new drug launches between 2017 and 2021 was 63 drugs per year. And that compares with 42 for the 5 years between 2012 and 2016. And it's also double that seen in the noughties right at the start of the century. So if we break down the data further, that shows that of these NASs, 17 were first in class, and we're going to take a closer look at those later. 30 were for orphan indications, and cancer was the most popular therapy area. Last year it was usurped by anti-infectives because of COVID, but this year it regains its crown. And of the companies, AstraZeneca had the most NAS launches with 5. So now we're going to take a look at those NASs launched last year that were novel in terms of their mechanism of action. So we have a strict definition of novelty, and that is a drug a drug is deemed novel if it's first to reach the market with its particular mechanism of action. And some of the products have more than one pharmacological action, and they are included if one of these at least is new. So of the 3 novel NASs on this slide, they were for cancer indications. And first up, we've got Amgen's Lumakras, which was the first KRAS inhibitor. This drug gave its first green light for non-small cell lung cancer in the US initially, but that was followed by a raft of approvals elsewhere. And it's a mechanism that's long been pursued by the industry. Currently, there are more than 70 potential KRAS inhibitors in active development. Amgen got there first, but its closest rival, Mirati Therapeutics, is currently awaiting approval for adagrasib, its candidate, which is also for NSCLC in the US. Obviously, this being cancer, Amgen is looking to expand its agents into a number of other tumour types, and colorectal is the indication that's the most advanced at phase 3. Then we've got Merck & Co., which launched the first hypoxia-inducible factor 2 alpha antagonist with Welireg, and that was in the US in September. So HIF2 alpha is involved in von Hippel-Lindau disease, and that's a syndrome characterized by visceral cysts and benign tumors, which can often become malignant. The drug came to Merck with its 29 acquisition of Peloton Therapeutics. Now, the final novel anti-cancer NAS in 2021 was developed under a collaboration between Rhizen Pharmaceuticals and TG Therapeutics, and that is Uconic. This is the PI3 kinase delta inhibitor, but it also has the additional novel pharmacology of casein kinase 1 inhibition. It was also first launched in the US, and that was for adults with relapsed or refractory marginal zone lymphoma, and it benefited from a priority review and breakthrough designations. Again, it's also being looked at for other indications. Most advanced is chronic lymphocytic leukemia, for which it's been filed, and there's also diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. Now we move on to the autoimmune and anti-inflammatory area, and this has enjoyed an unusually good year. First up, we have 2 new products for systemic lupus erythematosus, and that's starting with one of AstraZeneca's novel products, and that's Sasnilo. And this became the first interferon type 1 receptor antagonist when it was launched in Japan in November. Early in the year, the first APRIL inhibitor, TII, was launched in China. This is notable as it's a rare example of a completely novel mechanism coming out of Chinese research. Although, with the way innovation's going in that country, this could be part of a growing trend. So TII was developed by Remegen, which is part of Rongchang Pharmaceuticals, and it's a fusion protein which jointly targets BLyS as well as APRIL. APRIL, or CD256, is a proliferation-inducing ligand, and it's important in B-cell development. Next, we've got the only enzyme-based novel NAS of the year, and that's Hansa Pharma's Idefirix. That was, again, first launched in the US, and it's the first drug classified as an endopeptidase stimulant. It's actually a proteolytic enzyme derived from strep pyogenes. It's got a high affinity for IgG antibodies, hence its use in organ transplant rejection. It's also got potential for use in Guillain-Barré syndrome. So sticking with inflammation on this slide, we've got two products that target the complement system, and this is a complex cascade that's involved in clotting as well as inflammatory processes. So we have Chemocentrics, which launched Tavneos for use in severe active anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic autoantibody associated vasculitis, which is a condition in which blood vessels are destroyed by inflammation. So the small molecule drug is the first to target the complement C5a receptor 1, and it's got some potential following indications, including hemolytic uremic syndrome. And then finally, in this therapeutic area, we've got Empaveli from Apellis. It's the first complement C3 convertase inhibitor, and it was launched in the US last year for paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, which is another rare disease in which the complement system destroys red blood cells. This drug is a pegylated synthetic peptide, and it's also being developed for the eye disease geographic atrophy. So in dermatology, we have two novel agents, and they're both interleukin antagonists. We've got Leo Pharma's Adbury for atopic eczema, and that just squeaked to launch in at the end of last year. And it's the first interleukin-13 antagonist, and it's come in just ahead of similar monoclonals from AbbVie and Bristol Myers Squibb, and Almirall and Eli Lilly, which are both currently in phase 3. UCB introduced Bimzelx, and it's a dual interleukin 17A and 17F antagonist, and it's the 17F that hasn't been seen in a launched drug before. This agent debuted in Germany in September for moderate to severe plaque psoriasis, and it was swiftly followed by other launches in Sweden, the UK, and then the Netherlands. However, the product did actually see a delay in the US because of manufacturing inspections, but UCB is still hoping to have mega blockbuster sales from Bimzelx because of its head-to-head study where it beats Novartis's Cosentyx in the B-Radiant trial. So now we're going to look on to what was probably the most controversial of novel drug launches last year, and that's Biogen's Aduhelm. Obviously, a book could be written about this, but just to summarize briefly, it's the first beta amyloid protein antagonist to reach the market, and it followed a whole raft of failures to find a disease-modifying treatment for Alzheimer's. The FDA decided to give it an accelerated approval in June based on its ability to clear amyloid from the brains of Alzheimer's patients, and that's a surrogate biomarker. That approval came despite the fact that its own advisory panel has voted 10-1 against approval, and so it came amid quite a lot of outcry when Biogen went ahead and launched it, even though it was promising a confirmatory trial. The launch has been very rocky. Aduhelm has struggled to gain reimbursement, and it has been a complete commercial failure, despite a price cut after its launch. It generated just $1 million during the final 3 months of the year and $3 million for 2021 as a whole, and that compares to the $480 million that Biogen's been spending on marketing the drug. So what happens next with this product is going to be interesting. The CMS in the States has recently released its final word on Medicare coverage for amyloid-clearing therapies, and that's very restrictive and probably likely to spell the end for Aduhelm. Some commentators reckon the company will just scrap commercialization and possibly the confirmatory trial as well to save money. And then there was another nail in the coffin this week when Biogen withdrew its EU filing just ahead of an expected rebuff from the EMA's expert committee. Still, there are some anti-amyloid candidates in late-stage development chasing the Alzheimer's indication, so this is a field that's going to continue to be in the news. So lastly, we have an innovation in the cardiovascular sector, and that's Regeneron, which launched Exkeva for homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia in the US in February. This is the first of the angiopoietin-like 3 inhibitors, and its effect is to increase the levels of HDL, the so-called good cholesterol. So moving on to anti-infectives, there were 2 novel NASs in this therapeutic class in 2021, and the first is Pfizer's Paxlovid. That made a splash for COVID-19 when it was shown to reduce the risk of hospitalization or death by nearly 90% in the phase 2/3 EPIC trial, and it was launched at the end of the year. It was actually the second direct anti-SARS-CoV-2 antiviral to reach the market last year, and it followed Merck & Co. and Ridgeback's Lagevrio, but that was not counted as having a novel mechanism. Paxlovid, on the other hand, qualifies as novel because it's the first SARS-3 cysteine-like protease inhibitor to be launched. It's also pretty clear in that field. There's only one other similar product in the clinic, and that's a phase 3 candidate from Shionogi. The other novel antiviral last year was Takeda's Livtencity, and this is the first cytomegalovirus UL97 protein kinase inhibitor, and it's aimed to tackle CMV infection in transplant patients. First launched in the US in December, and Livtencity is Takeda's second NAS to receive approval in 2021 after it got the green light for activity in lung cancer, which was launched in September. So with this slide, we're moving on to metabolic diseases. First, we have BridgeBio Pharma's second product to market called Nulibry, and this is a molybdenum cofactor replacement therapy for this ultra-rare genetic disorder, which usually leads to death within months of birth. There are only around 150 patients born with this disease each year, so the price tag for this, what is a life-saving product, is pretty eye-watering at $500,000 a year. But that seems fairly small when compared with our next product, which is Ija Biopharmaceuticals' Leqembi. This treats another very rare disease called progeria, and it's also known as Hutchinson-Gilford syndrome. It's a condition in which patients appear to undergo accelerated aging, and it leads to death in the second decade of life. So Ija licensed Leqembi from Merck & Co, and the drug has multiple actions, and 2 of which are novel in a launch drug, and that's P-glycoprotein inhibition and MRP inhibition. And so Leqembi's price is more than £1 million per year, making it one of the most expensive drugs going. And then the final product on this slide is for a much more common disorder, type 1 diabetes. Lexicon Pharmaceuticals Zynquista, and it's a sodium glucose cotransporter 2 inhibitor. And obviously there are quite a number of these on the market already, but this one is the first which combines that mechanism with sodium glucose cotransporter 1 inhibition. This product is also awaiting approval for use in the larger markets of type 2 diabetes and heart failure. So that completes the first-in-class NASs. So we're now going to move on to some other notable launches last year. And unsurprisingly, that list was dominated by COVID. There's never been a single disease that has had as many drug introductions in 1 year, with 17 new drugs and vaccines in total. And they included 18 individual NASs, because one of the products was a combination therapy. As you know, the first 5 COVID vaccines, including the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna mRNA-based products, made the list in 2020, but they were joined this year by 11 more vaccines, starting in January with the launch of AstraZeneca and Oxford University's product. Then there was the Janssen jab, but aside from that, most of the other novel coronavirus vaccines were rolled out outside of Western markets. From vaccines, we're going to move to novel treatments against the coronavirus. We've already covered 2 of the small molecule products, Lagevrio and Paxlovid, but we've also got some new antibody products against the virus that we launched last year. There were 4 further products containing 5 novel NAS monoclonals, including the 2 in the AstraZeneca product. However, these have already, some of these have already had their emergency use authorizations either removed or curtailed because the coronavirus is mutating and escaping from these products, and they've lost their efficacy. Which just goes to show what a fast-moving area this is. So moving away from COVID, we're going to look at some other notable launches last year. And they included 3 CAR-T therapies, which effectively doubled the number of these products that are now available. 2 of these came from Bristol Myers Squibb. First up is Abecma, or Ide-cel, and that was for relapsed or refractory multiple myeloma. And BMS got hold of this product through its acquisition of Celgene. Bristol's other CAR-T was Breyanzi, or Liso-cel, and that debuted in the US for relapsed or refractory large B-cell lymphoma. And BMS obtained this through its purchase of Juno Therapeutics. The third CAR-T was from China's JW Therapeutics, and that's Relma-cel, and that was also launched for large B-cell lymphoma. So for metabolic disorders, other selected new drug launches, there are also some ones. The most interesting here are the biliary disorders, and that there were 2 first NASs mentioned at the top of the slide, which are both for ileal bile acid transport inhibitors. First up, we've got Albireo Pharma's Bylvay, and that was approved for progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis, or PFIC. And then Myron Pharmaceuticals' Livmarli, which joined it later in the year for the related indication of Alagille syndrome. And both of these are genetic disorders in which a buildup of bile leads to liver failure. Myron had originally intended to develop Livmarli for PFIC as well, but after Bilvai's approval, it decided to plump for Alagille instead. Then lastly on this slide, we've got Rhythm Pharmaceuticals' Imcivree, which is a melanocortin-4 receptor agonist and a melanocyte-stimulating hormone receptor agonist. And this is being developed for a number of genetic disorders that lead to early onset severe obesity and pathological hunger. And it was launched for its lead indication in September in the US. So the final slide of other notable new drug launches starts with Novartis' Leqvio, and this is the first of 2 RNA-based drugs. Novartis gained it via its acquisition of the Medicines Company, and Leqvio is only the 4th RNA interference therapy to be brought to the market. It works by silencing PCSK9 and is for use in heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. Next one is Sarepta's Amondys 45, and this is its 3rd product for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And it was launched in the US in June. And like its predecessors, Exondys 51 and Vyondys 53, the new product won accelerated approval from the FDA based on the belief that increasing dystrophin production will provide a clinical benefit. And there are confirmatory clinical trials underway. Finally, we have Merck and Bayer's Verquvo. This has entered a crowded heart failure market in the US, but it does have a specific niche indication, and that's for use in patients with reduced ejection fraction who have been hospitalized or need intravenous diuretic therapy. It's got off to a pretty slow start commercially, however, and it's only expected to bring in about 50 million this year. Merck, though, has recently been highlighting its cardiovascular pipeline as key to its post-Keytruda future. It's targeting about 10 billion in sales from the entire CV portfolio by mid-2030, and it hopes that Verquvo will contribute to this. And finally, in this section, I'm going to take a quick look at the performance of biopharma firms in terms of the number of NAS launches last year and their overall pipeline size. So as previously mentioned, AstraZeneca led the pack with 5 NAS launches. And in addition to its COVID vaccine, its 2-in-1 monoclonal antibody therapy for COVID and Safnilo, it also launched a new MET tyrosine kinase inhibitor for non-small cell lung cancer, and that's called Orpathys. As the chart shows, 4 firms had 3 NAS launches each. They were Bayer, GSK, Johnson & Johnson, and Merck & Co. And of these, Bayer had the best launch to pipeline size ratio. But GSK also performed well because it launched 3 NASs in 2020 as well, so it's the most persistent performer. Roche, however, was the only company from the top 10 firms missing from the list with 0 NAS launches. Another point to note is that 4 Chinese firms launched 2 NASs each last year, even though these companies were outside of the top 25 by pipeline size, again showing the growth of the industry there and the successes that it's having. So now I'm going to hand back to Ian, who's going to look at the 2022 pipeline in much more detail. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Just before we move away from new active substances, you might like to know that a supplement to the main Pharma R&D report, which focuses entirely on the new active substances launched during 2021, has also just been published and is also available as a free download. As Alex says, now we're going to move away from the drugs which were successfully completed their development last year to those which are in development currently. And let's start off by breaking down the pipeline by global stage of development. So you can see here comparison of how many drugs are at each stage in 2022 compared to 2021. You can see here that the biggest increases are seen at the early stages, with number of drugs in preclinical development being up by 11%, and phase 1 being up by 10.1%. So remember, the overall pipeline size increase was 8.6%. So these development stages are expanding at a greater rate than that. And as I mentioned earlier on, this is partly because so many drugs were added during 2021. The later clinical stages are also going up, not by such big a rate. Phase 2 by 6.4%, phase 3 by 8.7%. And if we take a look a bit further back along the years, we can see that that last piece of data is actually quite significant. The numbers of phase 1 and phase 2 drugs in those particular development stages has been increasing steadily year on year. But if you look at the numbers for phase 3, you'll see it had really plateaued in the last few years. And actually the 2022 figure sees it actually starting to recover from this plateauing. If you're wondering why the numbers of drugs in phase 1 and phase 2 look quite similar, when clearly a lot of drugs go through phase 1 and then fail and don't make it to phase 2, this is a function of this data being a snapshot. Drugs go through phase 1 quite quickly, but they take much longer going in phase 2. So you get a kind of a pile-up effect in phase 2. Let's move now to look at the top 10 pharma companies by pipeline size. And you'll see there's little change in the top 10 this year. Novartis is at the top, spending its 6th year there. And in fact, the top 4 are completely unchanged. The only change within the top 10 is that Lilly has re-entered at the expense of AbbVie. However, if you look at the numbers, most pipelines have actually shrunk slightly, with only AstraZeneca, Sanofi, and Lilly showing some growth. And AstraZeneca's growth could partly be explained by the fact it acquired Alexion. Overall, it was another fairly quietish year for mergers and acquisitions amongst the top 10, with Sanofi and Merck & Co. bucked the trend by buying 6 and 4 firms respectively. Sanofi bought Kymab, Tidal Therapeutics, Kiadis Pharma, Translate Bio, Cadmon Holdings, and Origin, while Merck acquired OncoImmune, Pandion Therapeutics, Velos Bio, and in the year's most significant deal, Acceleron Pharma. But against this backdrop, for the top 10, Roche, Takeda, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Johnson & Johnson stayed out of the M&A game completely. Overall, 116 mergers and acquisitions were reported by pharma projects across the year, down quite a bit from the 142 we reported in 2020. And you'll see, in fact, that Big Pharma is providing an increasingly small slice of the overall pipeline. What you can see on here, with the pale blue line, you'll see the percentage of the entire pipeline which has been originated at the top 10 companies. And you can see it's now down to 4.6%, down from 5.3% in the previous year. And the rate of decline has increased somewhat, whereas only a decade ago, the top 10 were providing around 13% of all drugs. Similarly, with the pink line, you can see the top 25 are also providing less of the pipeline than they used to, with their percentage being down to 8.5%, less than half the percentage it was 10 years ago. Meanwhile, the percentage from the pharma minnows, the really small companies, remains around the same. It's around 17%. It's shown a little bit of a fall this year, but overall it's been fairly stable. Despite the fall is despite there being a similar number of companies. So this would suggest that mid-sized company growth is fueling the overall pipeline growth. Incidentally, 48.8% of all companies involved in pharma R&D only have 1 or 2 drugs. So there are an awful lot of these really small companies around. Here you can see the disease focus of the top 10 pharma companies. There's a often received wisdom around these days that the big companies are increasingly narrowing their focus and just looking at particular handful of therapeutic areas. But our data would seem to contradict this because big pharma is really active in all therapeutic areas. You can see there the different therapeutic areas are color-coded, and this is how their pipelines are split across the therapeutic areas. So cancer, as you can see, is a big focus for all of the big companies, with Bristol Myers Squibb having the biggest focus on cancer. And it's the leading therapeutic area for all of the top 10 companies except Eli Lilly. So big pharma is still actually favoring broad portfolios. 8 out of 10 of the top 10 are active in all 14 therapeutic areas, and Merck & Co. has the largest percentage of anti-infectives. Moving on to look at the total number of companies with active pipelines in 2022, and again we're seeing another expansion here, not quite as big as the overall drug size, but the number of companies this year has expanded by another 6.2%. Over the year, 1,142 firms joined the pharma family, so these were companies which were newly identified by us during the year, which means a net of 725 left. So these were companies that were acquired, went bust, or just kind of went into hibernation mode. So it does mean that 19.2% of all the companies that we're following currently emerged during the past year, which is a fairly extraordinary statistic when you think about it, again indicating there's a huge amount of churn within the pharmaceutical industry. Whereas we saw earlier on, over half are really small. There are 759 companies with 2 drugs and 1,883 with just a single project. Moving on to look at the R&D pipeline by therapeutic area, and you won't be surprised to see that cancer remains the top therapeutic focus for pharma R&D. And in fact, it's ever more dominant. 39% of all drugs in development currently have at least one targeted oncology disease. That's up from 37.5% a year ago and 29.5% 10 years ago. And cancer itself grew by 14% this year, again bucking the trend of overall pipeline expansion. Neurologicals came in second. They grew by 7.8%, so slightly lower than the overall pipeline expansion rate. Meanwhile, anti-infectives came in third, up a paltry 4.7%. And this is really in contrast to what we saw in 2021, when there was a huge growth rate in anti-infectives, up 22.4%, fueled by the move into new COVID therapeutics. Here is the top 10 indications which pharma R&D is focusing on at the moment. So breast cancer is still the disease with more drugs being developed against it than any other, but its growth has really stalled this year. In fact, the number of drugs under development against breast cancer this year is almost unchanged from that a year ago. And it means that non-small cell lung cancer is catching up. It has an 11.5% pipeline expansion. COVID, the indication at number 3, which is a new entry last year at number 5, is up to number 3 and still expanding, up by 22.4%. We'll be looking at COVID in a bit more detail shortly. You might note as well that Alzheimer's has had a bit of a rally this year with an extra 60 drugs in the pipeline, and we wondered whether this might be the effect of Aduhelm's approval, which Alex referred to earlier. Outside the top 10, you'll see COVID vaccines at number 13, still rising. And you'll note that cancer has 15 of the top 25 diseases, so very significant. Although breast cancer comes in overall as the leading indication, non-small cell lung cancer is in fact the top disease in many regions, such as Asia and the EU. Interestingly, Africa has a very different profile to most of the rest of the world, with R&D there focusing on diseases which are particularly relevant to that area, such as HIV, haemophilia A, and tuberculosis. We can look at the top 10 mechanisms of action or pharmacologies in our database. Now, the mechanism of action classification we use is hierarchical, so therefore it's not surprising really that some of the broader terms that we apply to drugs dominate the top 10. And the biggest of these is immuno-oncology, up at another 14.8% this year. But if you look at the column second to the right, you'll see the percentage of the drugs for each of the mechanisms which are at the late stages of development, either at pre-registration, registered or launched. And you'll notice only 2% of IO drugs are at late stage. So that's an awful lot of drugs, a lot of faith in what is still a relatively unproven area. There are some other immuno-oncology related rises within this top 10 as well, with checkpoint inhibitors up by a third and CD3 nearly doubling there at number 9. Big increases too for genome editing and gene expression, and there's a new entry for a newly created category this year at number 8, protein degraders. Moving on to the top 10 drug protein targets, so these are the individual proteins which drugs are hitting, and again, cancer and immuno-oncology targets dominate. There's a new number 1 this year with the CD3 protein now the most popular target, and this is because it's a key target for bispecific antibodies. There are other IO-related rises in the top 10 with PD-L1 up to number 2 and CD19 and PD-1 also going up. And in fact, the top 7 are now all cancer targets. There was also a boost this year for a more of an old school target, 5-HT2A, up to number 10 for 23. And this is largely on the back of so many new drugs being identified this year against this target. So that's kind of the main pipeline, sliced and diced by the main metrics which we generally look at each year. But this year, we thought we'd also take a deeper dive at what we identified this year as being the key trends for 2022. COVID-19, rare diseases, cell and gene therapy, and China. We saw in 2021 that the response to COVID-19 from pharma continued. What you can see on this graph is the number of drugs added to the Pharma Projects database each month from the start of the pandemic in January 2020. You can see there was a huge peak during the first wave in April 2020, and it's never really come anywhere near that since. But the second year, there's still a fair amount of new R&D being identified, fewer candidates overall, particularly for new complication therapies, which fell back a bit, but new vaccine R&D is being sustained. It'll be really interesting to see this graph next year. I suspect we'll see further declines in 2022, and we may see the focus switching more to antivirals. The top 10 pharma companies all played their part in the response to COVID. They all had drugs or vaccines against COVID. Pfizer had the largest presence and the largest number of vaccines in development, whereas Bristol Myers Squibb was in the lead on antivirals. Roche focused more on complication therapies. Merck & Co had the smallest pipeline against COVID and avoid vaccines entirely. Rare diseases has been another big focus for pharma R&D for some time, and again, we saw further expansions 2021 to 22. At the start of this year, the number of individual rare diseases being targeted by drugs in R&D hit a new record at 677. That's up from 648 last year, and it's almost double those diseases that were covered in 2014. The number of drugs in development against rare diseases is up too, with over 6,000 drugs in development for at least one rare disease, up from 5,600 last year. And in fact, 30% of the entire pipeline of drugs are in development against at least one rare disease. What's the therapeutic area of rare disease R&D? Well, it's a little bit different than the overall therapeutic areas we saw earlier on. So this is actually counting the number of diseases which are being developed, which are being focused on for R&D. And probably not surprisingly here, alimentary and metabolic has the largest share. This is because there are many individual single gene defect metabolic and enzyme disorders covered in this number. Similarly, there's a lot of obscure and rare neurological disorders, so not surprisingly, neurologicals come in second, cancer comes in third with 14%, then infectious diseases at 12%. Rare disease has a big focus for big pharma, and in fact, all of the top 10 pharma companies are in the rare disease top 20. So this shows you the top 20 companies by the number of drugs they have against rare diseases. Novartis tops this chart too, with 138 of its drugs for rare diseases, or nearly 65% of its entire pipeline. 9 of the top 11 in this table are the top 10 pharma companies, with Eli Lilly coming in with the smallest focus on rare diseases. But you also see amongst the top 20 some smaller niche companies. For instance, Shape Therapeutics has the largest percentage overall in the top 20. It's a real rare disease specialist. There were lots of clinical trial starts in rare diseases during 2021, with the record being broken yet again. There was a slight dip in 2020, but there was a slight dip overall across the board in 2020 due to the hiatus caused by COVID. And it's also worth pointing out that the 2021 figure could actually rise even further because there's a reporting delay, which means not everything is picked up early in the year. Moving away from rare diseases, overall, our sister product Trial Trove reports that oncology trials are dominating the clinical trial landscape. There are over 16,000 ongoing oncology trials, which completely dwarfs second place central nervous system trials, which only have 6,000. And amazingly, considering it's only been 2 years, over 6,500 trials have been started in COVID since the pandemic started. Keeping pace with rare disease R&D, we see the number of orphan drug statuses granted, the number of expedited review designations granted, and the number of emergency use authorizations granted have also increased. 381 ODSs, which is the third largest on record. There were 341 expedited review designations granted, the most ever in a single year. And 39 EUAs granted, as this became a favoured way to deliver COVID therapeutics to the market quickly. Another big trend we've been noticing for a number of years is cell and gene therapies, and they really are soaring. What you can see here is the number of gene therapies in the pale pink and the cell therapies in the grey, the total number of drugs in the pipeline every year since 1995. And you'll see that gene therapy now tops 2,000. It's important to note out that there's a kind of an overlap between gene and cell therapy, in that the gene therapy number will include both in vivo gene therapies and ex vivo genetic manipulation, and this is often where genetic manipulation is done to cells before they're introduced as cell therapies. And the example here would be CAR T therapies. There's been a recovery after the early noughties setbacks, which were well publicised. However, recent regulatory difficulties could put the brakes on as we move forward. The number of cell therapies in development also topped 2,000 for the first time, and the actual overlap between cell therapies and gene therapies, cell therapies that have a genetic manipulation component, is at around 57%. We can also look at the different viral vectors being used in gene therapy, and this shows us that adeno-associated virus is the most popular vector. There are 466 drugs using this vector in development this year, up from 341 in 2021. The lentivirus vector has now claimed second place, and this is a vector that's used often in ex vivo gene therapy to transfect cells. Retroviral vectors also showed robust growth. Looking at the different cell types used in cell therapies, it's no surprise to see that T cells are the top choice because of their involvement in CAR T. There are over 900 T cell based therapeutics in development, and this includes over 700 CAR Ts. Stem cells are the next most popular cell type, with around 450 projects, and natural killer cells come in third. Finally, in this section, it's been a landmark year for Chinese pharma R&D as it finally moves into the big league. For the first time, there were 2 Chinese companies in our top 25 companies by pipeline size. Jiangsu Hengrui came in at number 16, moving up from number 37 with a huge 71% increase in its pipeline size, whereas Shanghai Fosun was at number 23, moving even quicker up from 66 and 127% increase in its pipeline size. And just outside the top 25, a third Chinese pharma company situated in the form of Beiji. Also interestingly, China is the first market now for 19% of those new active substances we looked at earlier. And this is up from 8.5% in 2020, so it has more than doubled. 3 Chinese companies delivered more than 1 NAS, Jiangsu Hengrui, Guangzhou Pharma, and RemeGen Rongchang. And what's really changing now is that Chinese companies are starting to originate their own new active substances. So I really think this is going to be a huge change that we see in the coming years. The number of Chinese headquartered companies has jumped nearly 50% in a single year. So Chinese HQ companies now account for 12% of all R&D firms, up from around 9% in the previous year. And the number of companies, as I mentioned, up nearly 50%, 43.3%. There were 792 in 2022 versus 522 in 2021. So China is really gaining ground here at the expense of the US, which lost 2% of its share down to 44%, and the rest of Europe segment, which was also down by 1%. So that graph looked at where companies are headquartered. This table actually shows you where actually R&D is actually occurring. And this will show you now that China is now the second most important country for pharma R&D. It has the second most many drugs in development after the US. The US is still way out in front, but 1/5 of all drugs are now in development in some form in China. And China has now moved into this runner-up position ahead of the UK. So it really is becoming a very, very important market indeed. So that concludes my quick review of the pharma R&D market as it is now. We're now going to put our crystal balls and look forward. I'm going to hand back to Alex for the outlook for pharma R&D in 2022.
Thanks, Ian. So in this section, as I said, I'm going to cast my eye forward to what's going to be in next year's NAS launch list. And I'm going to start with those novel products that have already received their first approvals or been launched already so far in 2022. So at the top of this list, the US FDA approved QUVIVIQ for adults with insomnia in January, and this approval is Idorsia's first. This drug produces not just improvements in sleep during the night, but also, and for the first time for an insomnia treatment, it improves daytime functioning. The product is a dual orexin receptor antagonist, and Idorsia is pushing this daytime functioning advantage over Merck's established insomnia drug Belsomra, which works in the same way. But that product has struggled commercially. Both Belsomra and another very similar product from Eisai called Dayvigo both come with label warnings about next day somnolence. However, QUVIVIQ has not yet been launched because it's had to wait for the FDA after the FDA recommended that it be classified as a controlled substance because it's got potential for abuse. But the company expects the pill to be available in May, so not too long to wait. And in the meantime, it's unveiled former Friends actress Jennifer Aniston as the face of its advertising campaign for the product, because apparently she's a long-term insomnia sufferer. Next, we've got Immunocore, which achieved several firsts with the US approval of Kimtrac. It's Immunocore's first approved product, it's the first approved T-cell receptor therapy, and it's the first drug approved for metastatic uveal melanoma. It's a bispecific immunotherapy, and it was approved in January, a month before its user-fee date from the FDA. And then finally on the slide, we've got Roche's new eye drug, Vabysmo. With this, the firm's hoping to take on Bayer and Regeneron's well-entrenched mega blockbuster Eylea, and that's because the new product has less frequent dosing and it's being priced relatively competitively. So the FDA has approved Vabysmo for both wet age-related macular degeneration and diabetic macular edema following a priority review. It's a bispecific antibody and it targets two disease pathways linked to a number of retinal conditions, and they are the angiopoietin 2 and vascular endothelial growth factor A. So Sanofi has launched Enjaymo, and this is the first drug approved to treat cold agglutinin disease. And it's also the latest in the company's efforts to build up its rare blood disease franchise. Enjaymo received US FDA approval in February to decrease the need for red blood cell transfusion due to hemolysis in CAD patients. The drug targets CSF1S and is meant to prevent the destruction of red blood cells. Sanofi acquired Enjaymo when it bought Bioverativ in 2018 for $11.6 billion, so it's seeing some return on that. Next, we've got Agios Pharmaceuticals Pyrukynd, and this was a significant milestone for Agios when it got the FDA approval of this, because it decided previously to sell off its commercial oncology portfolio in order to focus on genetic diseases instead. Agios has already been working on increasing screening for rare hereditary anemias and is trying to more than double the rate of patients that are currently being diagnosed, and this is going to be crucial for it to hit its sales targets. Pyrukynd is also in development for sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia, and if successful with these as well, the company hopes that it could bring in peak sales of $1.5 to $2 billion. Then lastly on the slide, we've got Janssen and Legend Biotech's Carvykti, which is a CAR-T therapy for multiple myeloma, also known as cilta-cel, and it targets the B-cell maturation antigen on myeloma cells. It's been launched with a list price of $465,000 for the one-time treatment, which is $45,000 above the launch price of its rival, the first-to-market BCMA targeting CAR-T therapy, which was Bristol Myers Squibb's Abecma. But Janssen reckons it's going to gain broader commercial and Medicare coverage for this product. So first up on this slide, we have CTI Biopharma's first commercial product, and that's the JAK2 IRAK1 inhibitor Vonjo. The FDA gave the drug accelerated approval in February, and that was for patients with intermediate or high-risk primary or secondary myelofibrosis with thrombocytopenia. And this makes the drug the first approved for cytopenic myelofibrosis. Unlike some other JAK inhibitors, Vonjo's label does not carry a black box warning, which should help differentiate it from its rivals. And some analysts say that Vonjo's annual sales could peak at more than $1 billion. Next up is Bristol Myers Squibb's relatlimab, and this is the first of a new class of checkpoint inhibitor, and that's the LAG-3 blockers. The FDA have approved relatlimab in a fixed-dose combination with Bristol's anti-PD-1 agent Opdivo, and that's for advanced melanoma, and the dual product is called Opdualag. So the approval is seen as important in offering Bristol some protection against Opdivo's US patent expiration, which is coming along in 2028. And relatlimab is one of the first of 3 significant novel approvals that BMS is counting on this year, because it really needs to offset the patent expirations, not just for Opdivo, but also for Revlimid and Eliquis, which is partnered with Pfizer. And we'll come to another one of these later on. Then finally on the slide, we've got Merck's Lenvima, and this is P2X3 receptor antagonist, and it received its first approval in Japan for chronic cough, but has been subject to some delays in the US. Again, Merck, similar themes, looking to diversify its revenue stream away from Keytruda, and this is one of the products it's looking to, but it's been hit with a complete response letter from the FDA earlier this year. Even so, Merck is still optimistic about it, being the first product to reach the market for chronic cough. Analysts, however, are a bit less optimistic about its commercial potential because they deem the drug to have relatively modest efficacy, and it's also associated with taste disturbances. So on the next slide, I've pulled out some approvals that have happened already this year in China. So sticking with the China theme, the government there has been trying to encourage innovation by Chinese firms, and has been granted pretty speedy clearances to domestically develop drugs that are novel. So far this year, and this is just some of them, we've got Jiangsu Hengrui's pharmaceuticals CD4/6 inhibitor, Irukang, and that's for advanced breast cancer. And it's the first domestically developed CDK4/6 inhibitor. And it's also been designed to reduce hepatotoxicity. Also from Jiangsu Hengrui is the SGLT2 inhibitor, hinagliflozin, and that's approved in January for type 2 diabetes. And then finally on this list, we've got Henlius Biotech's anti-PD-1 product, Hansixuan. That was launched in March for advanced unresectable or metastatic MSI-H solid tumours, so it's a tumour agnostic indication there. This is different because this product, this company has a lot of biosimilars in development, but this is actually an innovative product from Henlius. So for the last 2 slides, we're going to take a look at some of the novel products that are expected to be approved in the US later this year. And we're starting with Gilead Sciences' lenacapavir. And this is the first-in-class HIV-1 capsid inhibitor. Gilead's received a complete response letter, that was earlier this year, but stressed that it doesn't need to do any new clinical trials. The letter was to do with the vials being used to contain the drug. Lenacapavir is a long-acting antiretroviral, and it's been approved up for approval for heavily treatment-experienced people with multi-drug-resistant HIV. It's given injected every 6 months and has a breakthrough therapy designation. But it's also got potential for use in pre-exposure prophylaxis, and Gilead's really hoping that this drug will help expand that PrEP market. Next up is Lilly's tirzepatide, and this is set to be the first glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, or GIP, stroke a GLP-1 co-agonist, and it's awaiting approval in the US and EU for type 2 diabetes. If it does get approved, it's going to have to go up against the GLP-1 agonists, and these have been growing strongly in recent months. They include Novo Nordisk's Ozempic, or semaglutide product, and Lilly's own Trulicity. In phase 3, tirzepatide was showing better glycemic control and weight loss than the highest currently approved dose of Ozempic, which could be work in its favour, but there was some trade-off in terms of side effects that it's going to have to deal with. Even though tirzepatide could well become a blockbuster, but a large proportion of its sales could be from cannibalising Trulicity. Then we have Sanofi's Zempozyme, and this is a recombinant sphingomyelinase enzyme for Niemann-Pick disease. This is the only approved therapy globally for this rare disorder, and it came in Japan under the Sakigake or pioneering drug designation. Zempozyme is also pending US approval, and it's got breakthrough designation there, and a decision is expected in Q3. And it's also got prime designation in the EU, with a decision expected in the second half. So on the final slide, we've got a few other interesting products that are expected to gain approvals, starting with a couple of bispecific antibody products. As Ian said, bispecifics are a really hot area at the moment. So first up, we've got Roche's mosunetuzumab, and that's been filed in the US and EU for follicular lymphoma. It's a CD20/CD3 bispecific antibody. So it takes the anti-CD target of Roche's mainstay Rituxan and adds in the CD3, which is found on T cells. So as we said, there's a number of anti-CD20/CD3 bispecifics in development, and they are showing some strong efficacy, but Rituxan, and as well as Rituxan biosimilars, are still expected to remain pretty entrenched in the NHL treatment arc, so it's going to be quite difficult to dislodge that. But Roche is intending to move this new product into earlier line therapy, including first line, which is an area where Rituxan is dominating currently. Next, we've got Janssen's teclistamab, and that's under review for relapsed or refractory multiple myeloma. Another bispecific, it's targeting B-cell maturation antigen and CD3. It's got a 20th of July user fee goal date with a breakthrough therapy designation. It's also been filed in the US, in the EU, and has been submitted to the Swiss regulator through Project Orbis. That's intended to facilitate faster patient access to really high impact or innovative cancer therapies across multiple countries simultaneously. And then last but not least, we have Bristol Myers Squibb's mavacamten, and that's a first-in-class cardiac myosin inhibitor for obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. This should get approval in the next few days. It's got a PDUFA date of the 28th of April, again with a breakthrough therapy designation. And there are no drugs approved to treat the underlying cause of this disease. And the next competitor from Cytokinetics has only just entered phase 3, so BMS has got a bit of breathing space. It got hold of the drug when it bought Myocardia back in 2020 for $13.1 billion. And Bristol's got very high expectations. It's expecting peak annual sales to about $4 billion for this indication and other cardiac indications. So that's the end of that quick whistle-stop tour of upcoming approvals. And so I'm going to hand back to Ian, who's going to do a short recap.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So I think our conclusion in 2022 is, despite 2 years of COVID-19 pandemic, pharma R&D seems to be going from strength to strength. Pipeline growth accelerated again in 2022. So there are more drugs, more companies, more diseases, and more targets being studied than ever before. Now, pipeline growth isn't always a good thing unless you're producing new drugs at the end of it. But the good news is that we had a record year for new drug launches as well, with the record being smashed again. So considering all the restraints on pharma R&D that the pandemic brought in, this is a quite phenomenal performance. Key trends for 2021 to 2022 were obviously COVID again. The response continues, albeit at a lower level. Rare disease R&D continues to boom, and cell and gene therapy are also hot, although there could be a few dark clouds on the horizon there. I think one of the biggest stories of all really is China becoming a major pharma powerhouse. And this will be a really interesting thing to track as we move through this decade. So there's a very positive outlook for 2022 as the world begins to return to some kind of normal. As of writing, there were 12 approvals for new active substances already in Q1, and the impact of COVID-19 will undoubtedly continue, but we can see that pharma R&D is responding incredibly robustly from this. So with that, it looks like we've had like less than a minute left, so I don't think we're going to have any time for any live questions this time. We will get back to you if you put a question in the question box in the next few days. We'll get back to everyone who asked a question. In the meantime, I'd just like to remind you that everybody will receive a link a copy of the presentation, including the slides and the commentary. So if you miss something, you can always review it again at your leisure. But with that, I'd like to thank my co-host Alex and everyone who's on the line for taking the time out of your day to listen to us. Thank you very much, and hopefully we will talk to you again in next year. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.